everyone. In the previous lecture, I discussed the first chapter or the Samadhi Pada of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. In this lecture, I will discuss the Sadhana Pada, Vibhuti Pada and the Kaivalya Pada, which respectively are the second, third and the fourth chapter of the Yoga Sutra. If you remember, the Samadhi Pada begins with the definition of yoga as Chitta Vritti Nirodha. It explains the various kinds of samadhi, then of course it enumerates the various obstacles that come in the way of achieving samadhi and suggests the methods for removing the obstacles so that Chitta Vritti Nirodha or complete cessation of mental operations is achieved. It basically offers an overview of the purpose and the goal of yoga. It is about what? What is samadhi? Sage Patanjali has suggested various techniques to achieve the state of Chitta Vritti Nirodha. So, sadhana pada is about how to achieve the state of samadhi, as it highlights the importance of practice. In just 55 sutras, it provides a methodology for gradually removing the obstacles that block the light of the self which is within us. It presents theoretical determinants of the yogic practice to reach directly to the spiritual goal and take delight in the self within. It outlines the principles of Abhyasa and Vairagya, Ashtanga Yoga and Kriya Yoga, which I will discuss in a while. The outstanding part of this chapter is that it lays out an interface of philosophy, psychology and spiritualism. Let us understand how the chapter begins. The first sutra states, Tapaha Swadhyaya Ishvara Pranidhanani Kriya Yogaha, which means Kriya Yoga or the practice of yoga consists of three components: tapas, which is penance, swadhyaya, which is self-study, and Ishvara Pranidhana means unshakable faith in God. Now the Sanskrit word tapas means heat. So, in the context of yoga, it means heat generated by yogic practices which burns off impurities and purifies the yogi. So basically, the term tapas suggests purification of the body, the mind and the senses through consistent practice. Swadhyaya is self-study and may involve reading spiritual texts or repetition of purifying mantras such as the Pranava. Ishvara Pranidhana is surrender or dedication of all actions to Ishvara. So basically, the yogi begins with an unshakable faith in Ishvara and ends in the profound meditation upon him. A yogi does not become established in yoga if he or she does not practice tapa or penance. The 5 kleshas cannot disappear without penance. So, the yogi has to undertake the practices that require putting the body and mind through hardships and thereby increasing one's endurance. Ishvara Pranidhana, which is surrendering or dedicating all actions to Ishvara, too has great significance in this practice because it pushes the yogi towards swadhyaya or self-study, which in turn pushes him towards tapa or penance and which makes him surrender to Ishvara. These 3 components of Kriya Yoga are found in Ashtanga Yoga. In this context, the Yoga Sutra states, Yoganga Anushtanat Ashuddhi Shaye Jnana Diptihi Avivekaha Khyateh, which means through the practice of the yogasanas consisting of 8 components arises spiritual illumination or jnana, which develops into awareness of reality, that is viveka, along with the systematic destruction of impurities. As I discussed with you in my previous lecture, removal of the 5 kleshas is the utmost importance, as they are considered as obstacles or impurities which bind the human being, so that the attainment of the union or yoga with the higher self becomes impossible. These 5 kleshas are avidya, which is ignorance, asmita, which is egoism, raga, which is attachment, dvesha, which is anger or aversion, and abhinivesha, which is the will to live or clinging to life. It is absolutely important to understand these components of Ashtanga Yoga. Sutra 29 states, Yama Niyama Asana Pranayama Pratyahara Dharna Dhyana Samadheyaha Ashtau Angani. Meaning, Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharna, Dhyana, Samadhi are the 8 components of yoga. The yamas are the ethical restraints which form the basis for the other 7 components. Without the practice of yamas, progress to the more advanced practices becomes impossible. Sage Patanjali enumerates 5 yamas. They are Ahimsa, Satya, Asteya, Brahmacharya, Aparigraha, Yamaha. Meaning, non-injury, truthfulness, non-stealing, divine conduct, and non-covetousness are the restraints. The first, which is non-injury, is the absence of harm or oppression towards all living beings at all times. When one gets established in non-injury, whoever comes in his proximity abandons animosity. Second is truthfulness. It consists in true speech, which is in accordance with what is seen, what is inferred, and what is heard. The purpose of speech is to transfer one's own knowledge to another, and therefore it should neither be deceptive, nor erroneous, nor unfruitful. The aspirant of yoga must examine one's speech carefully and should always speak the truth, which is beneficial to all beings. When one gets established in truthfulness, the speech of the yogi becomes infallible. If he says, be compassionate, one becomes compassionate. If he says, proceed to Swarga, one goes to Swarga. Now third, which is stealing, is the acceptance of things from others against the laws of the scriptures. We must not, either by action or thought, seek to gain anything that is not rightfully ours. Therefore, it consists in the absence of the desire for anything which is not rightfully ours. When one gets established in non-stealing, all precious things come to him from all directions. Now, fourth is divine conduct. It is full control over the body and the senses. When one gets established in divine conduct, one attains vigor. And the last is non-covetousness, which means not accumulating things or receiving gifts from anyone. The aspirant of yoga must realize the blemishes attached to the material objects. For a person may take a wrong course of action in earning them. Once he earns them, he struggles to preserve them and spends sleepless nights at the thought of losing them. He gets trapped in attachment towards the material objects, and this brings about the downfall of the aspirant of yoga. However, when one gets established in non-covetousness, one realizes the reason of birth. One perfectly understands his self-existence with regard to the past, the present, and the future. Sage Patanjali makes it clear that these 5 yamas must be observed in all spheres, irrespective of caste, place, time, and circumstances. And when they are observed without exception, they being universal are called Mahavratas. Let's now move on to the second component, which is Niyama. Niyama are observances that help us in upholding our Dharma. Sage Patanjali gives a list of 5 observances. They are Shaucha Santosha Tapaha Swadhyaya Ishvara Pranidhanani Niyamaha. Meaning, cleanliness, contentment, penance, self-study and devotion to God are the observances. Now, shauch or cleanliness consists in maintaining physical purity and mental purity as well, and in fact purity of the environment. Physical purity involves external cleansing through bathing and internal cleansing through drinking water. Mental purity involves washing away impurities by practicing friendliness towards those who are fortunate and happy, compassion towards those who are unfortunate and unhappy, joy toward virtuous deeds of others, and indifference toward vicious deeds of the wicked people. When one gets established in physical cleanliness, one learns the defects of the body and begins to dislike it. He also stops associating with other bodies also. With mental cleanliness comes clarity, open-mindedness, one-pointedness, self-control, and capability of seeing the essence. Now, santosha or contentment is the absence of desire for procuring more than what is necessary. On being established in this state, one attains supreme happiness. Tapa or penance is to endure the pair of opposites like hunger and thirst, heat and cold, standing and sitting, verbal silence and non-verbal silence, and burning all the negative thoughts. When one gets established in tapa, impurities are destroyed and one achieves physical perfection as well as the perfection of the senses. For example, one acquires the ability to read the thoughts of others. But more about this when I discuss the Vibhuti path. Now, Swadhyaya or self-study is the reading of the scriptures to gain better understanding of the self and the repetition of the pranava. Now, self-study is not the usual reading of scriptures. It requires sincerity and a lot of practice. When one gets established in this, one is able to communicate with the devatas, siddhas and the great rishis. Last niyama is Ishvara Pranidhana or devotion or surrender to Ishvara, and it consists in the dedication of all actions to Him. This actually is where all our actions end. This is to be attained only by practice. Listening to discourses won't help. We see people doing all sorts of immoral activities throughout the day, week or month, and then one fine day dedicate all their actions to Ishvara by chanting mantras or reciting prayers. Do you really think Ishvara is someone who can be pleased by flattery? This dedication of all actions to Him is not easy. It needs some qualifications. However, on getting established in Ishvara Pranidhana, one achieves success in self-absorption. One's intellective vision knows everything the way it is. Anyway, now let's move on to the third component, which is asana. And the sutra says, Sthira Sukham Asanam. It means bodily posture must be steady and comfortable during meditation. This is important as mind should not get disturbed or distracted during this time. When one gets established in asana, one does not get troubled by the pair of opposites like heat and cold, etc. Sage Patanjali describes fourth component of the Ashtanga Yoga as Pranayama, and he says, Tasmin sati shwasa prashwasayoh gati vichedah pranayamah, which means on achieving a steady body posture, pranayama, which is breath control, takes place. Pranayama is regulation of inhalation and exhalation. It is of various kinds. Apart from inhalation and exhalation, there is also retention of breath as well as emptiness of lungs. One can regulate these four kinds. They can be made equal or different. Yogis can stop inhaling for long periods without dying. In this way, they gain control over prana. And when one gets established in the breath control techniques, the covering of the intellective light is destroyed. The Yoga Sutra describes the fifth component of Ashtanga Yoga as Sva-Vishaya Asamprayoge Chittasya Swarupa Anukaraha Iva Indriyanam Pratyaharaha, which means pratyahara is withdrawal of the senses from their respective objects. And in the absence of the union of senses with their respective objects, the senses begin to imitate the mind. And what happens? The senses are subjugated by the subjugation of the mind. In this manner, Sage Patanjali explains the sadhana or means for accomplishing Samadhi. Actually, Sage Patanjali discusses the last three components of Ashtanga Yoga in the Vibhuti Pada, which is the chapter on accomplishments or siddhis. Vibhuti Pada begins with the sutra that explains the sixth component, and it is Dharna. The sutra says, Desha bandhaha chittasya dharana, which means concentration is the binding of the mind in a place. It is the process of fixing the mind on places such as the head, the navel sphere, the lotus of the heart, the tip of the nose or the tip of the tongue. One could also concentrate on external objects like an idol. The seventh component is Dhyana, about which Sage Patanjali says, Tatra pratyaye ektanata dhyanam, which means meditation is the unbroken continuity of concentration. One may wonder why dharana and dhyana are considered two separate components as they appear to be one and the same. But you must know that there is a slight distinction between the two, as they are two separate stages. Dharana is about one pointed attention, whereas dhyan is a stage where the mind has been quietened, and in the quietness it is untouched by any other thought. Let me explain with an analogy which is generally given. Just as there is continuity in the flow of oil, in which the drops are indistinguishable, similarly, the object upon which the mind is fixed is continuous. Now the eighth and the most important component is Samadhi, about which Sage Patanjali writes, Tat eva artha matra nirbhasam swarupa shunyam eva samadhihi, which means as if empty of one's own nature, the purpose alone shines forth. That indeed is spiritual absorption. At this stage, the meditator merges with his or her point of focus and transcends the self altogether. In dhyana, reason is aware of itself as the knower, meaning the distinction between the object and cognition is not destroyed. However, in Samadhi, reason is so engrossed in the object that the object alone stands and the cognition disappears. There is no awareness of being aware of the object. Then the true nature of the object reveals itself. So one can say that Dharna is the process of maintaining the grasp of the object. Dhyan is the process of connecting with the object, while Samadhi is the process of communion with the object. Sage Patanjali calls the union of these three stages Sanyama. When one establishes oneself in Sanyama, intellective vision appears. The Yoga Sutra states that these three are direct means to samprajnata samadhi or cognitive self-absorption. The first five, that is Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama and Pratyahar, are the indirect means to samprajnata samadhi. However, in relation to nirbij or asamprajnata samadhi or ultra cognitive self-absorption, all 8 components are seen as indirect means. But as we already discussed, Ishvara Pranidhana is the direct means for nirbija samadhi. Vibhutipad, as I just said, is about accomplishments. A yogi detaches himself from every aspect of Prakriti or the world. He realizes his separateness from it and then enters it and becomes one with it, but does not give up his discriminatory power, and then he controls its movements. At every stage, the yogi acquires some extraordinary powers or siddhis. Remember the stages of samprajnata samadhi? A yogi, after a certain point, does not require perception or inference or testimony to cognize anything in the world. He can cognize through direct intuition. However, the extent of his cognition depends on the perfection of his samadhi. In addition to this, a yogi acquires the other siddhis like the knowledge of past and future, the knowledge of the meanings of words and sounds made by any living creature. He can also know his past births or what is in another person's mind. He can make not just his own body invisible but also of others. He can also obtain through samadhi the much talked about Ashtasiddhi or the 8 kinds of siddhis. The first is Anima. By gaining this siddhi, a yogi can become infinitely small. The second is Mahima. By acquiring this siddhi, a yogi can become extremely large. The third is Laghima. This siddhi enables a yogi to become extremely light. The fourth is Gurutvam. By gaining this one, a yogi can become as heavy as he wants. The fifth siddhi is called Prapti. By acquiring this one, a yogi can touch anything at any distance. The sixth siddhi is Prakamya. This siddhi equips the yogi with the power of obtaining anything that he desires. The seventh is Ishitva. With this siddhi, a yogi can obtain authority over everything. The eighth and the last siddhi is Vashitva. By acquiring this siddhi, a yogi can gain control over anything. Apart from these, there are other kinds of siddhis also mentioned in the Yoga Sutra. However, Sage Patanjali states that a yogi who aspires liberation must not get tempted by these siddhis, because temptation leads to attachment. Attachment leads to losing track of the actual goal. And once a yogi strays away from the path, he also forgets the truth about the self. Now, Kaivalyapad, which is the last chapter of the Yoga Sutra. It is about the issue of Kaivalya or liberation and how it can be achieved. The Sutra 34 of Kaivalya Path defines Kaivalya as the state of self-realization in which the Purusha gets established in his true nature. The purpose of his long evolutionary unfoldment has been attained. In this state, the gunas, empty of purpose, go back to the state of equilibrium, and thus the power of pure consciousness can function without any obscuration or limitation. I will end my lecture with this. Thank you so much.